Good morning, everybody. The weather outside this morning is amazing, isn't it? Feels great out there. I actually quite enjoy it, but when I walked outside this morning, I said, "Ooh, it feels good." Lily about slapped me. She doesn't think it feels as good as I do, but it is. It's not for everyone. Thankful for that you've made it out this morning, despite the cold, and for any who couldn't make it out because of the weather, the cold, and things of that nature. We keep in our prayers and certainly, of course, understand that. We're in Job chapter 34 this morning. Job 34. Elihu here is going to speak once again, and he's going to continue what he's going to continue his sort of speech. Elihu goes on for quite a long time before God comes into the picture. And actually, I'm sorry, it's not 34. We studied 34, 36. I was looking at the wrong page. Chapter 36. We already studied 34 last week. We have about 2 more chapters before God comes into the picture and starts questioning Job. And there's this interesting literary narrative flip on the head, because the whole really first part of the book is Job questioning God, and it's wishing that God would come to him and they can sort of battle this out in court, if you will, and Job can get his questions answered and all these things. And then God finally comes into the picture, and God actually questions Job and doesn't give him really the answers that Job wants. And I think that's a good lesson for us, because there are so many times where we want something from God and God delivers on something, but it may not be exactly what we want. It may be what we need, maybe something different. So a reminder that God answers prayer. He doesn't always answer it in the way we want. You know, he answers yes, no, he answers sometimes. He answers maybe or wait a while, you know. Sometimes he answers yes, but the conditions are a little bit different. You know, I may say, I want a Mercedes, and he says, well, yes, I will give you a car, but, you know, it'll be a Honda or something like that. So that's just a silly illustration. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that we should be praying for cars and those types of things. But sometimes God does come to us and present himself to us and answer our pleas and our calls, but it may not be the exact thing that we expect or the exact thing that we want. So in chapter 36, Elihu is going to continue on with his speech. And it says here, then Elihu continued and said, wait for me a little, and I will show you that there is still more to be said on God's behalf. I will bring my knowledge from afar and ascribe righteousness to my Maker. So here Elihu is claiming to be speaking for God. He's claiming to be speaking for God at this moment. Now, how did Elihu come up with all of this speech like he did? Well, I am convinced that Elihu had the Holy Spirit, and that he was quite literally speaking from God. Maybe not in every portion, maybe not in every line, but I am certainly convinced of that. It seems to be what he's saying here, at least one of the things that he's saying, that he will bring his knowledge from afar and ascribe righteousness to his Maker. He's going to speak on God's behalf. And this is prophet language. That's what prophets did. They spoke on God's behalf. They were sort of like a mouthpiece for God. God would speak to them, and then they would speak to the people what God spoke to them. And this seems to be what Elihu is saying. Now, whether or not, like I said, all of his lines are prophetically nuanced, that's another issue entirely. But I am convinced that at different points within these speeches, God spoke through Job some, and God also spoke through Elihu some. So he says in verse 4, for truly my words are not false, one who is perfect in knowledge, is with you. Now, you know, I don't think Elihu was talking about himself. I think he's referring to God. I think this is the whole point. So he says, basically, I'm not going to tell you false things. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you. Me? No. Don't think Elihu is saying, just bear with me, Job, and hear me out because I'm perfect in my knowledge. I don't think he was saying that. I think this is another instance of Elihu referring to God, saying, listen to what I have to say. I'm going to teach you things that are proper because the Lord, the perfect one, the one with perfect knowledge, he is the one that is in the midst of us. He is the one that is delivering these truths. So verse 5, behold, God is mighty, but does not reject anyone. He is mighty in strength of understanding. He does not keep the wicked alive, but gives justice to the afflicted. He does not withdraw his eyes from the righteous, but with kings on the throne. He has seated them forever, and they are exalted. And if they are bound in shackles and are caught in the snares of misery, then he declares to them their work and their wrongdoings, that they have been arrogant. He opens their ears to instruction and commands that they return from injustice. If they listen and serve him, they will end their days in prosperity, and their years in happiness. Okay, so Elihu says sort of about the same thing that we've read a lot throughout this book. He doesn't completely parrot the friends, although there is some similarity. Remember, Elihu is a victim of his culture and of his time, just like anybody else. And I do think also Elihu had some of the cultural leanings, of course, that the three friends did. Now, what is this about God will punish the wicked and he will give prosperity to people who serve him? Here's the thing. God does punish the wicked, but it's not always in our timing. God punishes the wicked, but not immediately. Let me give you an example. Look at all of us. God punishes people who sin, but not immediately, not all the time. So people who are wicked, who live in continual wickedness, will one day experience punishment of an eternal weight. However, some people who are righteous on this earth suffer for a time. Some are prosperous, but not every righteous person ends their life in prosperity. Does anybody know what happened to the Apostle Paul? How did his life end? He was beheaded. Now, I don't consider prison and government execution by beheading to be prosperity. However, that's what Paul went through. And, Paul was a saint. Paul was a Christian. So the point that I'm trying to make is that Elihu is true in his statements, but we must take these statements for what they are. So when Solomon said to train up a child in the way he ought to go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it, what does that mean? Does that mean that every single time you raise up your child right and teach him the correct things of the Lord, that they're always going to follow it? No, of course it's not what that means. Sometimes children are brought up and they end up leaving the faith, and it's by no fault of the parents or anyone else. It's just simply their choice. It's their will. So does that make Solomon's statement false? No, it doesn't make Solomon's statement false. Solomon's statement was never meant to be taken as an absolute universal truth. It was meant to be taken as a general truth or as a principle. That if you train up your child and you do it properly, then when he's older, he will continue with those traditions and those things that you've established within him. It's just like if I tell you that if the light is green, you should go because it means that you're free to go. Well, I'm not saying that every single time it's green means that you won't get hit by an oncoming car. Well, that happens all the time, doesn't it? But the general principle is if you wear your seatbelt and if you get into a wreck, you have a higher chance of survival. Although we know that there are people who have passed in car crashes with the seatbelt on, right? So it's a general truth, a general principle. And the same is applied in this text. There are some truths that are more general, that don't necessarily apply to every single situation. Okay, here's a universal truth. The sky is blue. That's a universal truth. So whether you're standing here in Marietta or you go down to Costa Rica, the sky is going to be blue. And that's just a universal truth. However, the more general principles of truth we find throughout the poetic nuance, and we have to be careful when we interpret these things, when we read these things. Excuse me. So, verse 11, he says, if they listen and serve him, they will end their days in prosperity and their years in happiness. But if they do not listen, they will perish by the sword and die without knowledge. Again, general truth, not universal. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. But ultimately, people who are Christians are going to probably die much happier than people who are outside of Christ, people who are not in the good graces of God. Okay, so we continue on. Verse 13, but the godless in heart nurture anger. They do not call for help when he binds them. They die in youth, and their life perishes among the cult prostitutes. He rescues the afflicted in their in their misery, and opens their ears in time of oppression. So he's saying that wicked people live rambunctious lives and typically die young because of it. That's just another general truth. It's not always the case. Certainly there are people who are wicked and who care nothing for God who can live a very long time on earth. But the general principle is that if you get into a bunch of rambunctious nonsense and you're constantly hurting yourself and your flesh with sin, then you probably won't live as long as someone who is more pious and more self-disciplined and more willing to sacrifice and things like that. So verse 16, then indeed, he induced you away from the mouth of distress, and instead of it a broad place with no constraint, and your table was full of rich food, but you were full of judgment on the wicked. Judgment and justice take hold of you. Beware that wrath does not entice you to mockery, and do not let the greatness of the ransom turn you aside. Will your cry for help keep you from distress, or all the exertions of your strength? Do not long for the night when people vanish in their places. Be careful. Do not turn to evil. For you preferred this to misery. Behold, God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? Who has appointed him his way? And who has said, you have done wrong? Remember that you are to exalt his work, of which people have sung. All people have seen it. Mankind looks at it from afar. So he's simply giving Job a warning. Job, in your misery, in this calamity, don't sin. Don't turn against God. Don't become evil. And this is a good warning. He's trying to remind him to keep a proper perspective on what matters. And instead of curse God, instead of question God, exalt God. Give God glory. Now, this is one of the hardest things that we can do as human beings in the midst of our suffering. We suffer greatly, and we almost feel like we need to ask why. We feel like there needs to be some grand reason. We feel as though we need justification for why we're suffering, and we may even lash out at God because we're suffering. God, I thought you were supposed to provide for me. I thought you were supposed to take care of me. I thought you were supposed to keep me safe, and now I'm run down here. You're afflicting me. Why? That's the natural response. But Elihu says, give God glory in your suffering. Exalt him. Tell him, yes, I'm weak. I'm so weak, but you are strong. I'm going to keep putting my faith and my trust in you because I know that ultimately you will deliver and you will provide and that even though I'm going through a rough time right now, it hasn't been all bad. This is the perspective that we also need to do our best to keep. Job lived his whole life up until this point with wealth and happiness and riches and all these things. And now he's going through this small period in his life that's really distressful. And then after this is done, he's going to receive back again more wealth and happiness and riches. So to Job, this is the end of the world, but to God, you see how he sees it, right? Job, I gave you this much time of wealth and happiness. Now you got a little sliver of hardship. And then I'm going to give you another giant span of wealth and happiness. And then you're going to get to go to paradise. When you see it in perspective, it's not as bad as what it looks like from the human eye. So I encourage us to look at our own life in the same manner. None of us like to go through hardship. When we do, let's think of all the relative ease and happiness that God has given us. And we can probably see that our blessings and our happiness and our wealth have far outweighed our hardship. So, certainly it was the case for Job, and he needed to be reminded of this to exalt God for what he's done for him rather than question and curse and go against God. So, he says here, all people have seen it. Mankind looks at it from afar, and then we leave off in verse 26. Behold, God is exalted, and we do not know him. The number of his years is unsearchable. For he draws up the drops of water. They distill rain from its celestial stream, which clouds pour down. They drip upon mankind abundantly. Can anyone understand the spreading of the clouds, the thundering of his pavilion? Behold, he spreads his lightning about him, and he covers the depths of the sea. For by them he judges peoples. He gives food in abundance. He covers his hands with the lightning and commands it to strike the target. Its thundering voice declares his presence. The livestock also, concerning what is coming up. So here we have God's wonders and his creation. He's unsearchable. He's unknowable. I love storms. There's probably an alternate life somewhere out there where I would have become a storm chaser. I just love them. I remember as a kid, at my grandparents' house, whenever there was a really bad thunderstorm and lightning everywhere, I used to want to go out and sit on the porch and listen to the rain bounce against the tin roof and listen to the thunder and feel the wind. I loved it, and I still love it. Years ago, when I was a kid, we had a tornado in New Martinsville, West Virginia, and everybody else was seeking shelter in their house, and I was trying to drive through the town seeing where it was. I wanted to see it. Storms are incredible, but they give true sign to the power of God, don't they? When you see a storm, when you experience a storm, you see what a storm can do, even just a simple thunderstorm. It gives a sign of the power of God. It shows us who God is. But at the same time, there's only so much we can know about him. At the same time, his ways are unsearchable. We see him through the storm clouds. We see him through the thunder and through the lightning. We see him in the wonderful creation, but there's so much about him that we do not know. Now, we know much more than what Job did because we have the revelation of God in the Bible. However, Job did not have all of this, and so Job only knew what he could perceive from creation and perhaps some revelation that God had given them. And so, certainly God's ways are unsearchable. We do not know them, yet we do know that he is powerful, that he is mighty, and that he has full control and full command over the earth and all of the elements. Okay, so that's chapter 36. Any comments or questions before we move on? Okay, chapter 37. At this also my heart trembles and leaps from its place. Listen closely to the thunder of his voice and the rumbling that goes out from his mouth. Under the whole heaven he lets it loose, and his lightning travels to the ends of the earth. After it a voice roars. He thunders with his majestic voice, and he does not restrain the lightning when his voice is heard. God thunders wondrously with his voice, doing great things which we do not comprehend. For to the snow he says, fall on the earth, and to the downpour and the rain, be strong. He seals the hand of every person, so that all people may know his work. Then the animal goes into its lair and remains in its den. From the south comes the storm, and from the north wind the cold. From the breath of God ice is made, and the expanse of the waters is frozen. Okay, so he's just, again, talking about the wonderful glories of God and of his creation and of his power and of his might. Remember whenever God spoke to the Israelites from Mount Sinai? Remember the Bible tells us that God answered in thunder? Now, I don't know what God's voice sounds like, obviously. God is God, so he can make his voice sound like anything he wants. But I can't imagine, I almost just can't help to imagine how strong and how powerful God's voice is. And it makes me think, honestly, about the baptism of Jesus, when he said, behold, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. It makes me think about what that day must have been like, what that must have sounded like, to hear that from the sky. Really, it'd probably be terrifying. To be on the Mount of Transfiguration and to hear the same thing. This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. I don't know what the voice of God sounds like, but I know it's powerful. And one day all of us will hear it. He likens his voice to thunder, of course, and to the great things that we see. He mentions also, as he continues on with God's glories, that the animals just accept it, and the animals live in accordance to it. Talks about animals going into their lairs and staying in their dens. I saw a video the other day of this bear exiting his hibernation. And it was hilarious because it looked like me when I wake up in the morning. I mean, it was just, this bear was just crawling out and stretching, and his hair was all matted down where he'd slept for, however many months they hibernate. It was funny. And it's comical to think that God would create such a creature that's so massive and so ferocious and honestly could kill any of us in a single swipe, and yet also made it like a teddy bear in a lot of ways, and made it to where it just slept for large portions. Why would he do that? Why would he make it like that? I don't know, but that's God did. And the animals don't fight against it. They just kind of accept it. They just do what they were created to do, and they live by the accordance of God. And I think that's kind of the point here. Elihu is trying to remind Job of what God does and the glories of God, and really the overtone here is that, Job, we need to understand who we're talking about here and who we're talking to. So he spoke about these things. From the breath of God, ice is made. So I'm not saying this is literal. I don't think Elihu meant this to be literal. Rather, it's poetic to say that God creates the ice. That's basically what it's being made to say. Somebody will say, well, no, that's not how ice is made. Ice is made by this chemical, scientific thing, whatever. Obviously, it's not saying that God, every time there's ice, breathes on the road. It's not what Elihu's meaning. He's simply saying that God creates the ice in a poetic way. Remember, this is poetry. Verse 11. He also loads the clouds with moisture. He dispenses the cloud of his lightning. It changes direction, turning around by his guidance, that it may do whatever he commands it on the face of the inhabited earth, whether for correction or for his earth or for goodness, he causes it to happen. Now think about that. So according to Elihu, sometimes storms by God are used for correction. What does that mean? Well, maybe it's correction of nature itself, to correct the order of things. Okay, sometimes storms and great events have shown to correct sort of the nature of things. However, maybe it's also for correction of humanity sometimes. Maybe sometimes storms are sent upon humanity for God's correction. Something to think about, of course. So, he says in verse 14, listen to this, Job. Stand and consider the wonders of God. Do you know how God establishes them? And make the lightning of his clouds to shine. Makes the lightning of his clouds to shine. Do you know about the hovering of the clouds? The wonders of one who is perfect in knowledge. You whose garments are hot when the land is still because of the south wind. Can you with him spread out the skies, strong as a cast metal mirror? Teach us what we are to say to him. We cannot present our case because of darkness. Shall it be told of him that I would speak? Or should a man say that he would be swallowed up? Now, people do not see the light which is bright in the skies, but the wind has passed and cleared them. From the north comes golden splendor. Around God is awesome majesty. The Almighty, we cannot find him. He is exalted in power, and he will not violate justice and abundant righteousness. Therefore, people fear him. He does not regard any who are wise of heart. So again, we have more of the same thing. He's just trying to remind Job, remember who you're talking about. Remember who you're talking to when you're beckoning this presence from heaven. He is the Almighty God. And he's not concerned with people who are wise in their own eyes. He doesn't need to answer any of our calls. He's doing just fine. So just remember that. And I think this is a great time to sort of pause and reflect on the fact that when we're going through whatever we're going through in life, it's always proper and it'd probably be good for us to just kind of sit down, take a second, and meditate on how powerful God is, on who God is. It doesn't matter what we're going through. Sometimes, sometimes we just need a reminder on the power of God. Okay. So, that's where Elihu finishes. Any questions, comments, thoughts before we continue on? Excuse me. All right. So now we're getting to the exciting stuff. Chapter 38, verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind and said, who is this who darkens the divine plan without words of knowledge? Now, tighten the belt on your waist like a man, and I shall ask you, and you inform me. So sometimes we get prayer answered, and then it's not actually what we want. Sometimes we don't know what's best for us. And you know how children ask for things, and they beg for things? Oh, please, please, please. And the parent says no. And the reason the parent says no is because the parent knows that it's not good for the child, but the child wants it really bad. But the parent says no because it's not good for you. You know, sometimes we are like children, and we ask for something a lot, and we want it really bad, and God may say no. And there's a reason sometimes that he says no. And it's because God knows better than us. And now Job's getting his wish. He's getting his prayer answered. But he's not really going to like it because God's not going to come down to him and be his therapist. God's going to come down in thunder and tell him what he needs to hear. So God says, who is this who darkens the divine plan? Some of your translations probably say, who is this who darkens counsel with words without knowledge, something of that nature. Counsel, of course, is just meaning the directive law of God, the divine plan or the divine law of God, the precepts and the principles that surround who God is. And then he says, by words without knowledge. So this is a key point. We can't miss this. According to God, the words that had been spoken were without knowledge. And now God says, I'm going to ask you questions, and you give me answers. You've been wanting answers for yourself. You've been questioning me now however long. Now I'm going to ask the questions, and you give me the answers, and tell me if you can. So he continues on. Where were you, verse 4, when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the measuring line over it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? By the way, God can be sarcastic. I mean, don't we see that here? Yeah. You know, you see the creation and see that God has a sense of humor. And I think you read his word and you see that God can also be, he has a personality. He's a being. He's a personal being. And he can be sarcastic if he wants. Verse 5, who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the measuring line over it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So he's talking about the creation of the earth. He's saying, how did I create it? Do you know? Do you know all the intricacies of it? Do you know what I did? Do you know what happened? And he mentions something interesting here. He says, the sons of God shouted for joy. So this would be a good point in our study to try to backtrack our minds to the very beginning. We remember this phrase was used at the beginning of Job, the sons of God. It was used whenever the sons of God met with God. And remember, the adversary Satan appeared among them. So who are the sons of God? Or what are the sons of God? Oh, come on. That short-term memory doesn't last very long, does it? Go ahead, Jim. Yes, the angels. That's correct. So angels. Remember, this is fundamental, guys. You got to remember this. So just go back and study it. Chapter 1 of Job. The angels meet with God. Okay, very important. So now he says, the sons of God shout for joy. Who's that talking about? The angels. So in other words, when God created the earth, the angels shouted for joy. Now, why is this important, Hunter? Because it gives us a revelation that angels existed before the earth did. What an amazing thing. We don't know that. Aside from this verse and perhaps a few other verses, that God created the angels and the angelic world perhaps before he created us. What an amazing thing to comprehend. Now, of course you could say, well, of course he did, Hunter, because Satan was a fallen angel and Satan tempted Adam and Eve and whatnot. But we don't really know, of course, when Satan fell. We don't know how long Adam and Eve were in the garden before the serpent came. We don't know all those things. However, we do know from this verse that the angels, the sons of God, were created. They existed before the earth was created. It's a wonderful thing to think about. It gives us insight into the very beginnings of time. So, they all shouted for joy. Verse 8, or who enclosed the sea with doors, when it went out from the womb bursting forth, when I made a cloud its garment and thick darkness its swaddling bands, and I placed boundaries on it and set a bolt and doors. And I said, as far as this point you shall come, but no farther. And here your proud waves shall stop. Now, I don't know all the science behind, the shores and the tide and things. Last I looked, it has something to do with our moon. However, this is a poetic way of saying that the reason why you have things like seas and seashores and that the water just doesn't rampantly run everywhere is because I control it. I say this is how far you can come, no farther. So isn't it interesting that this world, what is this planet, 75% water or something like that? I think that's the last I heard. It's like 75% water. I could be wrong about that. But it's a lot of water, right? Why doesn't the water just fill the whole planet? Well, there are probably a lot of reasons, obviously a lot of scientific reasons. Ultimately, it's because God said it wouldn't. Ultimately, it's because God made the earth that way. You know, if God wanted to, he could make the earth out of jello. I mean, and it could make sense. You know, God is God. He can do whatever he wants. So God says that I created the seas as they have been created. Explain to me how it works. So, verse 12, have you ever in your life commanded the morning and made the dawn know its place, so that it would take hold of the ends of the earth and the wicked would be shaken off from it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and they stand out like a garment. Their light is withheld from the wicked, and the uplifted arm is broken. So now here he's talking about, of course, sunrise, sunset. Have you ever commanded the morning? God ensures that these things happen day by day. When you look at our solar system, when you look at our life on Earth, everything is sort of balanced on a razor's edge. You know, I think if we were just a hair closer to the sun, we'd burn up. Just a little bit further from it, we'd all freeze to death, you know. Everything is balanced on a razor's edge. Why is that possible? And why isn't it that in a world of chaos, in a world, in a universe of black holes and meteors and asteroids and everything else, why isn't it that things have changed? Why isn't it that there hasn't been some giant changes? Why is it that the sun still comes up every morning? It's obviously because God wills it to be. You know, if God just kind of let this creation do its thing and never intervened, we probably all would have been dead a long time ago. But God intervenes, and according to God, he says that he commands the morning. So he says, have you ever in your life commanded the morning? This is a good reminder to say that in our suffering, there are times where we might not even want to go another day. There are times where we don't want to see the next day. And yet we have no control over it. And the next day is not guaranteed. You know, what God is saying is that I'm the one who guarantees the next day for you. I control the morning. You've never controlled it in your life. So I give you everything, and now you're complaining. Now you are suffering, of course, but you are questioning me about this. Well, what about all these other things that I do? How do I do these things? These questions that God's giving Job, and obviously Job won't be able to answer. So he continues on in verse 16. Have you entered the springs of the sea and walked in the depth of the ocean? Here the gates of death have been revealed to you, and have you seen the gates of deep darkness. The ocean is extremely deep. There's a place in the, I think it's I think it's the Mariana Trench. Is that how you say it? Does anybody know? Nobody knows? Okay. I think it's the Marina or the Mariana or something like that. There's a trench, okay? And it is in, what sea is it in? I can't remember what sea. Man, I'm really fumbling this hard. Mount Everest can fit in the trench. That's the point I'm trying to make. So there's a part of the ocean that's so deep that if you could take Mount Everest, pick it up, and place it down in that trench, and the water would cover Mount Everest. That's how deep that trench is. So you look at Mount Everest and you see it goes above the clouds. Now turn that upside down and think of it going down in, and it goes down in that trench with a lot of room to spare. So when God talks about the depths of the ocean, it's very deep. And we still don't really even know how deep. We can only go down so far. And a lot of people that I've read recently have said that we still don't know exactly how deep some of the deepest parts of the ocean are. So it's incredible to think about the depths, if you will, the depths of the ocean. And here's God's question to Job. Have you walked in the depth of the ocean? Of course, Job hasn't. God has, in a sense. He created it. So God knows what's down there. And God knows how deep it is, but Job doesn't. And then he says this, the springs of the sea. And some translations there say fathoms, and others translations say paths, I believe. Does any of your translations say paths of the sea? Paths of the sea. Yeah, Kathy. So, and this is mentioned again in another place in Job. Many years, people read this and said, what does this mean? There are no paths of the sea. There are no springs of the sea. This is false. And this is just another example of why the Bible is wrong. And I want to say about 150 years ago, somebody discovered that there were actually paths and springs in the sea. So it was a recent discovery, but of course it's in one of the oldest books that we have in mankind. Why? Obviously, God knows what he created before we discover it. So God knows, but certainly we don't always know, and Job didn't quite know either. So, verse 19. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? In darkness, where is its place? That you would take it to its territory and discern the paths to its own. You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. Again, more sarcasm. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for a time of distress, for a day of war and battle? What is the day that the light is divided and the east wind scattered on the earth? Who has split open a channel for the flood and a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land without people, on a desert without a person in it, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the seeds of grass to sprout? So here's a good example, by the way. Whenever we complain about rain, we should read this verse and be reminded that rain isn't always for us, that God sends rain for the earth's purposes too. He says, I'm in charge of sending rain on desolate places where there's not even people there. So, rain's not always, we like to complain about the rain. Oh, it's raining, it's going to be a rainy week, it's raining all the time. But the whole world doesn't revolve around us. God makes sure that it rains whenever he knows it needs to rain for other purposes. So it may not always be for us. We need to remember this. So, he continues on in verse 28. Does the rain have a father? Or who has fathered the drops of dew? From whose womb has come forth the ice? And the frost of heaven, who has given it birth? Water becomes hard like stone, and the surface of the deep is imprisoned. Can you tie up the chains of Pleiades, or untie the cords of Orion? Can you bring out a constellation in its season, and guide the bear with her satellites? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens, or do you establish their rule over the earth? Beautiful language. Again, here we see ancient knowledge of the constellations of the stars. And God is questioning Job about these things. He continues on. Verse 34, can you raise your voice to the clouds so that an abundance of water will cover you? Can you send flashes of lightning so that they may go and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the innermost being, or given understanding to the mind? Who can count the clouds by wisdom and pour out the water jars of the heavens? When the dust hardens into a mass and the clouds stick together, can you hunt the prey for the lioness, or satisfy the appetite of young lions when they crouch in their hiding places and lie in wait in their lair, who prepare feed for the raven when its young cry to God and wander about without food? So God says basically, here's the things you can't control, Job, and you don't know about. You don't know about the creation of the earth. I created it. You don't know a thing about it. You just benefit from it. You don't know about the seas. You don't know about the storms. You don't know about the clouds. You don't know about the rain. You don't know about how the young is fed, the animals. You don't know. You do not know. You can't control it. You don't know anything about it. And eventually, he's going to get to the point where he starts talking about all the grand creation. He finishes his speech, in a sense, gets close to the finishing of it, with the behemoth and the Leviathan. And the behemoth and the Leviathan are interesting because we really don't know what those are. The behemoth is a massive land creature, and the Leviathan is a massive sea creature. And that's about probably as accurate of a description that I can give you at this time. We don't know what they are, but we know they're massive. We know that no man could tame them. We know they're huge. And God essentially is telling Job that if you can't control them, if you have no power over them, if you cannot even so much as understand them to the point of taming them, then there's no possible way that you could ever match up to me, because I created them. So ultimately, what happens at the end of this book? What happens to Job? Does he continue suffering, or does he receive a blessing from God? Yes, that's correct, Sarah. So he receives a blessing. He gets, as Sarah said, his fortunes are restored to him. And a wonderful thing about this book is that, yes, God questions him, and God kind of puts him through a ringer here with his voice. However, Job, in the end, is prosperous. So thank you all for your time and attention this morning.